Hello, welcome to week one of Conflict in Professional Life. I'm Dr. Alan Goodboy, and I'll be narrating some PowerPoint slides here that coincide with your week one reading, which is chapter one. In this course, we'll talk about how we handle conflict more effectively, how we become a more competent communicator next time we're fighting with someone. So I want you to think about some things next time you go to work. I want you to think about next time you're reprimanded, or next time you argue with someone over a personal issue, next time you call someone a swear word behind their back, perhaps, or next time you hear some gossip occurring at work, next time you maybe avoid talking to someone for a few days because they've made you angry, or maybe think about when you see your coworkers cry, or arguing, or even unable to resolve disagreements because they don't get along. All of these examples are potential conflict episodes that could happen at work. And as you think about these episodes, they should be relatively common because conflict at work is absolutely inevitable. So I'm going to give you an overview of some terminologies here and what to expect in this course, and kind of get some of the language down, some of the conceptual ideas down before we move into detailed content and empirical research findings. Your book does a good job of telling you why we should study conflict, what is important about conflict, and it talks about fine-tuning your expertise and how we want to be both effective and appropriate communicators. I want to be effective in the sense that next time I fight with someone, I want to get my needs met, get my goals accomplished, but also I want to be an appropriate communicator and not trample on other people's feelings. So we'll talk about that in this course. Your book talks about how conflict is very common and that conflict does span the lifespan, and it starts in childhood. Your book talks about how it begins usually with a parent or caregiver, and that there are conflict episodes with toddlers. Many conflict episodes, about 7 or 8 per hour if you talk about exchanges of disagreements. And children argue and engage in conflict about all sorts of issues. Drink your juice, don't throw toys. We don't hit people. You say these sorts of things to toddlers, and hopefully they understand it. So conflict starts very early on. We know that during adolescence, especially in high school, we're seeing a lot of conflict about different types of relationships. We're seeing peer conflict, family conflict. We're seeing bullying occur. So conflict doesn't stop during those teenage years. And then obviously with adults, it continues. And you're an adult right now, and you're still having conflict. Most adult conflict tends to be romantic conflict. We know that unhappy married couples have conflict at least once a day, and satisfied couples have conflict once every 5 days. Workplace conflict is very pervasive. Oftentimes those things that irritate us or frustrate us throughout the workday tend to shape our experiences and culture at work. So conflict is absolutely common. We know that people develop through conflict, that conflict is necessary for our personal growth, and that children growing up with conflict learn different ways to handle it. And so really our early experiences with conflict help kind of shape how we handle and think about conflict now. And it's important that we understand that people might be different in terms of their thinking, behavior, and appearance, which leads to conflict through our incompatibility. The way I prefer to handle conflict and the way you prefer to handle conflict might be totally different given the way we think about things. So people do develop through conflict. It changes who you are. The book talks about diminishing aggression. Oftentimes people engage in a conflict episode who are fighting resort to physical violence. And about 20% of romantic partners resort to physical violence, and about 20 to 25% of teenagers report serious disagreements with emotional or psychological distress. We don't want to turn to aggression as a means of handling conflict. We'd rather communicate more effectively. So that's another reason we should study conflict. And finally, conflict is linked to our actual physical health. When we fight with people, it increases our blood pressure, it hurts our immune system, and it's associated with depression. It disrupts our sleeping. I don't know if you've ever had a bad fight and then try to go to bed and you have trouble you toss and turn all night. You have trouble sleeping that night. There's an interesting study by Glaser that looked at people's blood pressure after conflict. They took blood and they had an intravenous methodology. And people talked about their conflict episodes and stayed overnight in a hospital. And couples that talked about their negative conflict behavior, such as criticizing people, putting people down, affected their blood pressure during the talk, and their immune system was actually lowered 20 hours later. So conflict can totally disrupt your immune system. A study by Levinson and colleagues in 1994 was interesting that found that women experience more negative and persistent physiological outcomes than men. That when we do fight, if you're a woman, it actually disrupts your physiology more than it does a man. When we get more upset about their conflict, and it affects their bodies more than it does men. And then Corey Floyd, who's at the university, he's at Arizona State University, has some really interesting research that looks at affectionate communication. When we're nice, when we hug people, when we kiss people, when we give them affection, he found that actually kissing people romantically lowers cortisol and stress hormones in your body. And then actually writing a love letter actually reduces your cholesterol temporarily. So fighting and conflict are totally linked to your physical health. There's lots of evidence that suggests this. And finally, we study conflict to have satisfying relationships. Our conflict might terminate a relationship. Okay, our conflict might end our loving relationships, and we want to preserve those relationships. A study in 1983 by Stella Ting-Toomey found that couples who complain and defend themselves mostly are unhappy. So we want to have satisfying relationships. We don't want you to be unhappy. The working definition, and this is also in your book, of conflict is as follows. In this class, we'll talk about conflict as an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving these goals. So we're looking at conflict as resources, and looking at conflict as goals, and looking at conflict as people getting away of achieving what we want to achieve. And since this is conflict in professional life, oftentimes we're going to refer to workplace examples of other people interfering with our ability to do our job, or our ability to maintain friendships at work, or our ability to travel, or ability to please a customer. Okay, all of these examples are inherently conflict because there's a struggle between two people who depend on each other, who are competing for some. Okay, so your week one activity will focus on levels of conflict and types of conflict. And so there are tables in the book and examples in the book and a lot of good information here. And I need you to understand this material because we'll use it later on in the course. But your book talks about level one, conflict, okay? And we want to use these terms throughout the course, so make sure to take notice of them. Level one conflict involves problems with specific behaviors. So we can have conflict with people based on what they've done to us. Behaviors are things we do. And so maybe someone gossips about you at work. Maybe someone excludes you from a workplace event. Maybe someone is driving in a manner that stresses you out. These are all behaviors because, again, they are things that you do. So level one conflict are typically actions or behaviors that you would find to be irritating or frustrating or annoying. People do things, and the things that they do have the potential to annoy you. That's level one, behavioral. However, sometimes conflict can be level two. And level two conflict involves relational norms and rules. And so we have rules at work, right? Those rules can be explicit, they're in the employee handbook, or they can be implicit, just things that you're expected to abide by. So what's expected at work? What are the rules? When people break rules, obviously you have a problem not with their behavior, but with them violating a potential rule that they're supposed to abide by. And so we have rules all the time. We have rules in relationships. Maybe a rule in your relationship is you should call your partner before you go to sleep. Or maybe your rule as a parent is I don't let my kids watch a rated R movie. Or maybe your rule is that you shouldn't be Facebook friends with an ex. Rules are made, and when rules are broken, level two conflict ensues. And those rules at work are especially important. And each organization has its own sets of unique rules that are implicit or explicit. And finally, level three conflict involves personal characteristics and attitudes. And so when you have level three conflict with someone, you really have a fundamental problem with who they are as a person. There's something you don't like about them and what makes them a unique individual. So we're talking about things like beliefs, or maybe religion, or maybe attitudes, or maybe you don't like someone's personality. So maybe you have conflict with someone who has an anger problem. That's level 3 conflict because you have a personal issue with who they are as a person. Or maybe you have a jealous partner, someone who constantly questions you all the time. That would be level 3 conflict. Or maybe you have a friend who's not trustworthy and you have an issue with who he or she is as a person. And level 3 conflict tends to be the most intense forms of conflict. But level 1 conflict, that's behavioral, we can forgive people. They've made a mistake, they've done something that irritates us, they can apologize. Level 2 is a little more severe typically because they've knowingly usually broken a rule. And level 3 conflict tends to be the most severe because when you have a fundamental problem with who somebody really is deep down, that's unlikely to be resolved so easily. So these levels of conflict are important to consider, and again, you'll be using them to classify different types of conflict in your week 1 activity. Something to keep in mind, and the book talks more about this, is actual versus perceived conflict. Okay, conflict can be actual, meaning it's really occurring, or just perceived, because communication is in the mind of the receiver. So perceived conflict might be not real conflict. It might be just the perception that there is conflict, but both are equally as destructive because conflict is a perception. So perceptions are not always accurate, right? What I perceive to be real may not be real, but it doesn't really matter. When it comes to conflict, if someone thinks there is conflict, then there is conflict. Whether or not it's real or not doesn't matter as much as the perception that it's there. We remember around 9% of what we talked about an hour ago. Okay, so our perceptions are flawed. We forget a lot of details. We forget a lot of what happened, but we can still be mad days later. And if you've ever been in conflict with someone and didn't even remember what you're fighting about, that's one of those issues that our memory fails us, but the perception that conflict is enduring is still there. Types of conflict are the second portion of your week 1 activity that you'll need to know. And again, your book has tables and examples of types of conflict that might occur. And this terminology is important in the clinical sense because we want to understand that conflict can occur over those 3 levels that we just discussed and through these types. And so parallel conflict is very common in the sense that it's conflict that has an objective basis and is perceived by both parties. Okay, so when conflict is parallel, that means I think there's conflict, and if I'm fighting with you, you think there's conflict. We both objectively agree that we have conflict. So maybe I admit to you that I don't like you, and maybe you admit to me that you don't like me. That is parallel. Okay, we both agree that the conflict is occurring. So with displaced conflict, we know there's a reason for the conflict. That the conflict exists, but the perceptions of why our conflict is occurring is wrong. So both parties would know something is wrong, but their perceptions are a little bit off target. So for example, if you're on a date with somebody and your date looks really, really bored and kind of has that face that's suggesting they don't really want to be here, You would assume that they're bored, but perhaps your date actually is upset with you over something else you've done. So it's like boredom and it's sadness, and both your perceptions are wrong as to why the conflict's occurring, yet you both know that there's a reason for that conflict existing, that there's something wrong. You're just not sure what the wrong is. Misattributed conflict involves who was the source of the conflict. We misattribute who was in the wrong here. So I might, for example, not get reimbursed some money on a trip, and the person who owes me the reimbursement maybe will blame me for not handing my paperwork in time, but I blame the person for not reimbursing me because they didn't fill out the paperwork. So, who is the source? We misattribute who is the real problem here. Latent conflict is conflict that should be occurring, but it isn't occurring and has not occurred. So the book talks about how there's a basis for the conflict that exists, but it hasn't come up yet. So if you ever had some conflict kind of brewing, like you need to have it out with somebody, you need to fight with somebody, but it hasn't happened yet, that would be latent conflict. I remember one time at work, there was an authorship issue on one of my publications, and I had collected some data, and my co-author decided to put me on as the last author. We had not negotiated what author I was going to be. And I would avoid this person at work for a while because I was mad at him or her. And that was really latent conflict because I felt like I was being screwed over here with my authorship, yet we really weren't fighting it and having it out. So maybe that person wasn't really aware of how upset I was. And finally, we have false conflict here. And this is when people disagree. They have no basis for disagreeing. So they're fighting when they shouldn't be. And this is what we would call a typical misunderstanding. Sometimes during a meeting, you might see somebody text messaging, and normally that would be bad behavior, right? That's level 2 conflict typically, because you're violating a norm or a rule in the organization, but maybe there's an emergency, and this would be false conflict because someone might need to text if there's an emergency, if someone was in the hospital, if someone was ill, and normally that would look bad, but in this case it would be acceptable. That'd be false conflict that's occurring. And so finally, we know that conflict can be very mild, starting with a mild difference of agreement, and moving all the way up to disputes, to campaigns, to litigation, people get sued, and even to fighting and war. So the little things, the little bickering we might do day to day with our loved ones start with mild differences, but conflict can lead up to countries literally fighting each other in war. So something to consider here is that conflict can be very, very mild up to very, very severe, and conflict can literally change the world. So thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and this should coincide with most of what the book says, and you should have enough information now to complete your week 1 activity, which is to distinguish between the levels and types of conflict. This activity is posted on eCampus.